So I'm really excited about this evening. First of all, thank you, Arts Club. Thank you, Janine. Thank you, Molly, for letting me host this series. And thank all of you for coming on a Tuesday night, which is not an obvious night to go out. I'm really excited to talk to Lucian tonight. And we were talking before, and I said, when did I first meet you? And we couldn't exactly remember. We think it may have been in California. But one of the great things I admired about Lucian early on is he tolerated all my questions. And I kept kind of poking at him, you know? And every time I saw him, I'm sure he's like, here comes that guy again. I was just like, tell me more about your experiences. I want to learn about these photographs. And so it's just been a pleasure over the last couple of weeks to spend more time with him and interviewing him, and over the last couple of years, really getting to know him as an incredible photographer and as a friend. And I'm so excited to bring his work here this evening and have him tell you about these intense experiences he's had all over the world. So there was a description I read online, and if you'll permit me to read here, it said, Lucian portrays the hopes and weaknesses of the people in his photographs in an unconventional manner. He has a unique human emotional ability to use the camera to capture and translate the world around him. And I think where we really see that play in these images is where the photographer fades away and all you see is the image. You forget that there's someone behind this camera. And I think that's really the true power in Lucian's work. And tonight we're going to talk about his conflict images, which are only a small part of all of these intense bodies of work he's done domestically around the United States on a variety of issues. So with that, we have 123 images to look at from all around the world. I know everyone's going to have questions at the end of this, so I want to jump right into the beginning of this with...
Before you do...
Go.
Before you do, thank you for inviting me. This is amazing, and this space is totally amazing. You guys have a wonderful thing here. This is really beautiful, and obviously you're taking advantage of it. You're doing great events. And I'm thrilled to be here, so thank you.
So the first Intifada, can you put on the first image? Let's take a look at it. And this was the first conflict zone.
Well, this was the first conflict zone outside of the United States, and when I say that, I grew up in Washington. I didn't grow up in Washington, D.C., but I worked for the Washington Post, and we had a lot of conflicts there. Besides Congress, also just covering, we'd cover riots and protests, and I remember before this getting caught between the Park Police and the Ku Klux Klan, and the Park Police were lined up in their horses, and the Ku Klux Klan were here, and I said, I'm going to get right in the middle and photograph both of them, and just as I did, the horses charged, and I was stuck right in the middle of it, and of course they had tear gas and everything else. But the first overseas assignment that the Post sent me to a conflict zone was the first Intifada Palestinian uprising in 1988, and I had no idea what I was getting myself into. It was a real learning experience on many, many levels. One of which was, the first thing I learned is, and you know this as a photographer, is it's so easy to become sympathetic to one side or the other. You spend time with the Israeli soldiers, you feel the fear that they fear when they're being attacked, and when you're with the Palestinians, the Israeli soldiers look like Darth Vader. So you really have to be always careful of knowing that you've got to tell both sides of the story. And this was particularly something that I learned here. And
what's happening in this photograph? Who is this person being carried aloft?
This is, I was just thinking I could have done a better job of putting these in order. This is in Nablus, which was a hotbed at that time on the West Bank, and we traveled there. And the other issue that we ran into on the West Bank is that no one liked us. The Israelis thought that we were Palestinian sympathizers, and the Palestinians thought we were spies. So we were sort of dancing around wherever we went, and we go to Nablus, and we're walking around, and we run into some Israeli soldiers, and they're telling us to leave because if you stay here, they're going to start throwing rocks, and you're causing trouble. And then all of a sudden, we hear this gunfire. And so we run around the corner, and the Israeli soldiers had killed a young Palestinian kid who turned out to be somebody that this town really loved. And just ensuing chaos happened. For myself, what happened is all of a sudden Palestinians were running towards us, and I watched on the side of my eyes, one guy pulled a knife out, and he was going to stab my partner. Chip hires another photographer, just out of anger, and I grabbed Chip and pulled him away, and the guy just kind of made the motion and kept running. But it was a very intense experience. And then we had some kids come up to us and they said, we'll take you to where the body is, which is this photograph right here, back here, with the family. And when we first went in there, they turned on us just out of anger.
What happened when they turned on you?
Well, they just started throwing stuff at us and yelling at us, so we kind of stepped outside. And then you can see back here this street. This is actually, it wasn't in here, it was in the family home here. So they carry the body across the street, and the Israeli soldiers are driving their jeeps as fast as they can through the streets to prevent them from taking the body to be buried. And once we got here, after I took this photograph, I turned around and a Palestinian had this big machete, and he's yelling, "Spies, spies!" And he came at us, and at that point I said, "Let's get out of here." So we ran, and we turned the corner, and then the Israeli soldiers popped out and started shooting at us. And I don't know whether they were real bullets or not, but at that point we just left. But this was something that happened to us almost over and over again every day when we were out. When I was out there, I was out here for almost a month. And it was like every day I woke up, I just dreaded the next,
Well, yeah, so how does day 2 happen? Right? This happens on day 1, and you're like, right?
Well, my first response was, oh, it couldn't be any worse. There's no way it's going to get any worse. But, it was really interesting. There's a lot of lessons I learned. One was how back during this time, the photographs that we sent out were censored by the Israeli military. So I had to show them the photographs before they were sent to the Washington Post. And, they would look at the photographs and go, oh, there they go, playing to the cameras again. So there's this amazing disconnect between the Israelis and the Palestinians about the other side. They just saw them as non-human. They just didn't see them as real people. And this is a theme that I would see over and over again, is how the other side becomes the enemy to such an extent that you become oblivious to any pain that they're suffering. And this was the case in this. And this is the Israeli soldier that, as I said before, I spent time with them as well. It was interesting. I left, this was 1988. I remember leaving when I left, and I said, there's just no way anything is going to be resolved here. And then years, not too long later, 1993, I can't say his name, Rabin and Arafat were at the White House signing the peace accords. And they were this close to doing something. It fell apart, and it's too bad. But to me, it was amazing that something almost happened. Because when I left this, I just didn't think there was any hope at all.
So you're a tall Westerner who's there with a camera in these conflict zones, and you alluded to the fact before that the Israelis said, don't come around, you'll cause problems or you'll incite. Did you find that to be a case? Did you find that when you had your camera in these spaces, things performed differently for you?
Yeah, and that's something that you have to always be aware of, because, and this is true in Washington, D.C., you'll walk by the White House and they see you with the camera, and all of a sudden the signs go up. So you have to be very aware of that, and there were a lot of times when we just had to walk away from a situation because we knew that people were gearing up because the press was there, and especially in situations like this, which is much more volatile than a protest, like in Washington or whatever. But yeah, once the camera is there, you're part of the story, and you have to be very careful in terms of how you deal with it. I find that what's the good news is, and one of the things that I've always done is that if you stay in a situation long enough, they forget about you, and they become less and less aware of you. And you know, one technique that I've used over and over again is I'll take, you know, especially if somebody's always looking at you, like take my photograph, I'll just start taking their photographs so many times that at some point they get tired of it. And so I always do, you know, a lot of people just turn away. I do the opposite.
Right.
It's like I'll get them so tired of me being there that at some point they'll, you know, just be who they are.
Right.
But that's a big challenge.
Right. Can move forward to your, let's see, where are we going to next in Afghanistan? So you were sent there to cover the Soviet withdrawal.
Yes, the Post sent me my first time to Moscow in 1988 to cover the Reagan-Gorbachev summit. Mm-hmm. And the Post was hoping that I could somehow, I mean, this was like a dream, especially back in the Soviet times, to fly through Siberia and get to the border where the troops were being withdrawn, and that didn't happen. So, and actually this is a story that was in many ways a failure, because I never did get what the Post wanted, nor did I get into Afghanistan. But what I did do was get to the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan. And, you know, at this time I think Afghanistan had a population of 7 million. 1 million had died in this war. And I think almost half the population became refugees. Mm-hmm. And so all these refugees, millions of them, were along the border. You know, I should stop and say, you know, one of the real tragedies of Afghanistan, and maybe some of you who are a little bit older than me, and I'm pretty old, I had friends of mine that were a little bit older than me that talked about how in the 70s they would get in a Volkswagen bus and drive from Europe through Iran, through Afghanistan. They'll go to Kabul, they'll drink at the cafes, smoke hash at the cafes, talked about the beautiful women there. And that's all gone. You know, Afghanistan's just been destroyed. And this was the period that it started, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And part of the reason I put this in here was this was the beginning of our involvement. And I think a lot of people forget this. But I was in Peshawar, which was a city very close to Afghanistan and Pakistan. And the U.S. was sending in millions of dollars to aid and to give weapons to the Mujahideen. Well, a lot of the Mujahideen became Al-Qaeda. You know, what happened from here was this was the beginning of the fall in Afghanistan. So I put these that's why I have these photographs. The other reason is this is a typical story of how you don't want to mess with the Afghans. This guy was a Mujahideen fighter who he was deep in Afghanistan, stepped on a landmine. You can see he lost both of his legs. They put him on a horse, and he traveled on a horse for 3 days across the mountains back to Pakistan, and he's still alive. I mean, these people are just totally amazing.
And how did the story come about? You said you'd met some of the Northern Alliance people who brought you in to show you what was happening with the landmines there in Afghanistan and what was happening to the civilian populace?
Right, but that's later.
Okay.
That's in 2001.
Okay, pardon me.
This is 1988.
Okay. So the Gulf War, now you were embedded, which was a whole kind of like post-Vietnam, control the media, control the message. What was that like being embedded?
Well, you know, it's funny. I think back to the Gulf War. There's a couple of things I remember. One is I'm a product of Vietnam in the sense that I almost got drafted, and I remember the Vietnam War very vividly. And of course, all the mistakes. And you know, I was naive from the standpoint of believing that we would never do anything like that again, you know. And so the Gulf War happened, and it was really interesting. The military had the same thing. We're not going to do any of the mistakes that we made in Vietnam. So they had a lot of, and it reached to the level, for example, where the troops always had to be in full battle gear. They always had to be fully dressed, because remember in Vietnam you'd see the half-dressed soldiers. That's how far they went in terms of making sure this is not going to be anything like Vietnam. I was sent with the 3rd Cavalry Armored Unit. I was as you say, embedded with them, and we were way out in the desert on the border of Iraq, in Saudi Arabia. And I'm with the troops here, waiting for the order to go in. And it's really interesting. Everybody was really scared because, number one, they didn't know what was on the other side.
Right.
And, you know, they were thinking of gas attacks, nerve gas, and all the soldiers had the nerve gas inoculations. And, you know, it was a typical story, too. These guys had been there, this was in January, and they had been there since, like, I think, September. And they were already getting letters from their wives like, "See you later, buddy," you know. What can you do? You know, you're out in the desert.
And all waiting to go in. And so what happens when the order comes to go in? What takes place?
The order, we find out like the night before you're going across. And everybody, of course, myself, I'm like, oh my God, you know. So, and we went across at nighttime. No, actually, I take it back. It was late in the day, but by the time, there were just waves and waves of tanks going across the border. And by the way, the commander that I was with flat out told me he had been to Vietnam too, and he said, "I hate the press. You're not going to see a thing." And he was right. They had me back with the logistics in a Jeep. And what happened to us was we crossed, by the time we crossed the border, it was nighttime. And they had this policy of lights out. You could not have your lights on when you're driving, because if you did, they would assume you were an Iraqi tank or something, and you'd get killed. Well, we had one guy with night vision driving, and he got totally lost. So we're out in the desert, and no one knows where they are. And all of a sudden, he's totally panicked. He goes, "Oh my God, there's an Iraqi tank in front of us." You know, I'm like, oh God. And all this, then all of a sudden we heard this above us. And it turned out that it wasn't an Iraqi tank, but an Apache helicopter that was hovering like right above the ground, looking at us, trying to figure out who we were. Finally, we found the pack, and we went for, basically they drove nonstop for 3 days, no sleep. And the war was over. And we were near Basra, and I'm like, "Let me out of here." So they said, they released me. I had to go all the way back to Saudi Arabia, which took 3 days. I jumped in the car and went to Kuwait City. And the tragedy in Kuwait was that the Iraqis, of course, had held the city, and they pushed a lot of the Kuwaitis outside of the border. And a lot of them were trying to come back in, but the Kuwaitis weren't allowing them in. They were only allowing, they had this kind of a caste system. They were only allowing the wealthy in first. So all the other Kuwaitis had to stay outside the border in camps for several months before they were allowed back in. And these are some of the, and it's kind of sad because I was with a U.S. group, a small battalion that saw these refugees and go, "Oh, we'll help you." And they got them all together, and they were driving them to Kuwait City, and the Kuwaitis stopped them and said, "You can't bring them."
This is recurring in your work, the refugees as human face of kind of like the people with the non-combatants in these scenarios, and the tolls that it wreaks on the civilian populace. And yet we see that repeatedly, and we'll continue to see this evening through other parts of your work.
Well, they are, there's a lot of victims in war, and, the other thing is when you talk to a lot of these refugees, like I have, you know, a lot of them are like, yeah, I was a teacher, I was a, you know, doctor, and all of a sudden I'm here in this car with my family. I have nothing. I've lost everything. And that's really stayed with me through all these conflicts, is how quickly, and I think it can easily happen to any of us. I hate to say it, but it's true. Your life can be over like this in terms of just everything turning around. It could be an earthquake, it could be anything, but all of a sudden you're out in the streets, and you know, and that's something that I saw over and over again with these people. And
so what is this here? This is an image that you had for a while on the front of your website. It's such an enigmatic and complicated image.
when the Iraqis lost and left Kuwait, they set fire to all the oil wells. And it really looked apocalyptic. I mean, you could be in Kuwait City and it would be dark at noon. It would look like it was 8 o'clock at night because of all these, you know, fires and the smoke and everything else. So this is, on one occasion I drove out to photograph the fires, and I saw this donkey out there, and I was kind of like, wow. So I get out of the car and I walk out, and it's kind of a young donkey, and the donkey is actually pulling up bedding from an Iraqi trench, and it's playfully throwing up this small piece of mattress, which is kind of hard to see. And I was mesmerized by this, and I sat in about an hour almost and just photographed it. And it's getting darker, so I, you know, turned around, started walking back to my car, and I just felt like there's something behind me. And I turned around, and this donkey was following me.
Oh my!
And I really felt guilty. It was like, you know, there's no way this donkey's going to live out here. It's not going to survive. You know, I mean, but what am I going to do? You know, I'm in this little car. So, you know, I'd leave, and, you know, I don't really think anything of it except about, it was like almost 2 years later, this photograph was part of an exhibition in Boston. And I received this call out of the blue from this guy that worked at the World Wildlife Federation. And he calls me up, he goes, I just want you to know, I saw your photograph. He goes, I was there because our group went into Kuwait immediately after the war to save the animals in the zoo. And I don't know if any of you remember, but the zoo animals were not fed for months during this whole time. So it was a kind of a horrendous situation. And he goes, but I also went out to those oil fields and I saw that donkey. And I put him in my pickup truck and drove him back to Kuwait and gave him to a family. So every once in a while you get these little stories.
Chechnya. So you spoke about these young Russian soldiers who were in impossible situations. What did you mean by that?
Well, Chechnya was, to me, another example, and it was more raw. What I mean by this is another thing that I saw over and over again were just young, inexperienced soldiers. And in the case of Russia, and it's true even with our troops, you know, a lot of them are from small villages. They have no idea what they've gotten themselves into. And a lot of these soldiers were just scared out of their mind. And of course, in Russia, you can drink, so they would drink a lot too. And it was like being in apocalypse now. And it's not this same situation, but this is a downtown Grozny, which is the capital of Chechnya. And as you can see, it looks like something out of World War II. I mean, it was so destroyed. But I was walking along the street, and by the way, this is after the war, the fighting. And I'm at a bus stop, and there's a couple of Chechen, you know, women standing there. And this Russian patrol drives by, and the guy fires his .50 caliber, whatever caliber machine gun they had, right above our heads, just to do it. But that's, it was insanity. But it was really interesting. About 3 years later, I did another project of a small village in Russia, and we ended up spending time with a lot of these Russian people, so kids that had been to Chechnya, and they were just totally destroyed. I mean, it's stories that you hear about what's happening to a lot of our Iraqi veterans. But this was a very tragic war. Half of Grozny was Russian, and so a lot of the refugees were Russian too. But to me, the other really tragedy about this, and I was saying earlier, I spent a lot of time in Russia. 95 was the whole democracy movement in Russia, and the Russian press did an amazing job covering the war in Chechnya. And a lot of Russian journalists got killed covering it. So for me, it's sad to see that this vital free press that Russia was starting to develop, was destroyed, by, Putin and what happened years later in Russia. And it's another common theme, as we've seen with the Arab Spring, is that everybody wants so badly to have a freedom of voice, and it takes years and years to happen. It's even like with the Obama administration. I remember how excited everybody was, but nothing happens overnight. And it's the case in Russia. I mean, Russia has changed in many good ways dramatically since I first went there, but it's just something that's going to take a very long time.
At the same time, Yugoslavia starts to boil over as well.
Right.
And this whole concept of ethnic cleansing starts to rear its head again.
And the first time I was in Yugoslavia, this is actually, I got drawing a blank on the name of the town, but this is the flashpoint of where the war started between the Croats and the Serbs. And this is a school that these kids are still going to, even though it's totally blown up. But what was really amazing to me, I traveled through Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, was everybody that I talked to, they kept saying over and over again, we never dreamed this would ever happen. We didn't think this would ever happen. And it became a situation where almost overnight neighbor turned against neighbor. As a matter of fact, I remember interviewing he was a Bosnian Croat who grew up in Bosnia in a very ethnically mixed area. And he was in prison, and he was petrified, and all of a sudden he realized that one of the guards was somebody he went to high school with. And he went, oh my God, I'm so relieved. And he went up to this guy, and this guy just beat the daylights out of him.
Interesting.
And
it really was, as you talked about, this micro-fissioning of culture, where things just came apart along ethnic lines.
And it comes apart because of the politicians. Milosevic, Tudjman in Croatia, that was how they came to power, was through fear and, they're coming to get you. The Muslims are coming to get you. The Serbs are going to rape, each one were telling these fantastical tales that in the end became true.
Right.
Because they figured, hey, if they're going to do it, I'll do it.
Right.
And that's exactly what happened. And, one of the tragedies is that I luckily didn't spend the time that a lot of journalists spent, and this is in Sarajevo.
What happened to
this is a young kid that stepped on a landmine. For years and years, they were covering all that was going on. They said, no one's listening. And if you remember back, that war dragged out for years before finally the public started, becoming interested, and countries said, we have to do something.
It's a refrain, unfortunately, we still have.
Yeah.
So Kosovo,
Kosovo is part of, Kosovo is just below Serbia and was part of Serbia. So it's part of this ethnic conflict once again.
What did you see when you came to the border there? You were telling me you finally, you made your way through, and what did that scene look like with all these refugees amassed on the border?
Well, okay, it was really interesting. When this was happening, I flew to Greece. We drove to Skopje, Macedonia, which is, it's a European city. And then early the next morning, we went to the border, which was only 20 minutes away. And there were, I think it was 50,000 refugees. And what had happened was the Serbs were mass evicting the Kosovar Albanians out of Kosovo, and they would be at the border. And a lot of these were, this is Europe, so these are people that look like us, so to speak, that, as I was saying before, literally in their home, having dinner, and then all of a sudden they find themselves out on a road being marched. And they're in this no man's land because Macedonia at this time was not allowing them into Macedonia.
These are middle-class families.
Yeah. So they were, they were stuck in this no man's land, and they had been there for 5 days. No, no shelter. It had rained, and everything else. There were, some Red Cross and people trying to help them out, and myself and the Macedonian police weren't or the military weren't allowing us into this, where these people were, but we were finally able to sneak in, and it was utter chaos. And one thing I remembered is this woman came up to me and she goes, "I think my mother's dying. We have $1,000 that we were able to scramble. I'll give it to you if you can get her out." And there's nothing I can do. The only thing I could do was point them to this Red Cross, facility that was already overpacked. But there was, not a lot you can do. So it was a very, very desperate situation. And finally, after a few days, with a lot of pressure, the UN came in and they started putting these people in camps. And and this is actually the first day I snuck in on this truck that was throwing out milk to the crowd, as you can see here. And
how do you're a human being. You empathize with these people. How do you separate that right? There's the grandness, the largeness of this conflict, and here you are as this woman's asking you to help. How do you cope with that?
Well, the first thing you think about is you hope that your photographs are going to make a difference. And, I should back up. The first day that I was there, this photograph ran on like A32 about this big. Mm-hmm. So it was frustrating to know that, maybe you're not having an impact. Sometimes you just don't know. But, I think for me, it's especially when you spend time with people that are allowing you into their lives, you feel a responsibility. Look, they are giving you this access. You've got to try to do something. Mm-hmm. And for me, this is the best way to do it. There are a lot of people, you go to, and this is a good example of it, there's a lot of, I met so many incredible people that were, that worked at relief agencies, that were out there doing what they could to help these people. And of course, a lot of people, even within the refugees were, heroic in terms of helping people. And this going back to, as I said, one day you're at your house, then you're at the border, and then they put you in these buses, and then they take you to a refugee camp. And what I would see over and over again is when people reached this and they saw the refugee camp, that's when it hit them. My life's changed. This is where I'm living now. And I think that's what you're seeing in a lot of these pictures in the buses is this is what's happened to us. that's one of the camps. What would happen too is as buses arrived, people would come looking for relatives, and also, did you hear about what happened in my village? You know, so there's this communication thing going on. So there was two months of bombing, refugees coming every day, and then finally K4, the war ends basically. They negotiated a thing with the Serbs, and there's a phased pullout. So we follow K4, which is basically NATO, into Kosovo, and then we start to see the damage and the destruction that happened there. And amazing stories. This was a family that stayed there. Her husband this was a small town, and her husband was the gynecologist for the town, and he delivered all the babies.
That's him in the back.
Yeah.
There.
And I mentioned that because we were with them, and they were describing what was going on and how their son, who was 20, 21 years old, one day went out to try to get some, I think to try to do their laundry or something, because it was isolated, and he walked out and the Serbs just shot him. And so they're telling us a story, and then eventually as we're leaving, the doctor, he had this epiphany, he just went, oh my God, and he screams it out. He goes, I just realized I probably delivered the boy that killed my son. And that's when the mother, I was starting to tear up. I mean, it's like, that was such a heavy statement when you think about it, and was so indicative of what goes on, you know, in these wars, where people you live with all your lives, you know, turn against you. So, and then the flip side that would happen is, you know, of course you develop this tremendous sympathy for the Kosovar Albanians, and then as you come in, the only Serbs left in this area are mostly older women, or people that decide to stay. And in this case, this woman's husband was a teacher at one of the schools. And he asked the soldiers, he says, I'm going to go back and, you know, get all my stuff from the school. And they said, well, it's too dangerous. And he goes, I've taught there all my life. They're my friends. And they go, look, well, let us at least drive you there. So they drive him there, and then they say, we really should go with you in the school. And the guy goes, no, I'm fine. Just wait for me outside. He goes in, he never comes back out. They can't find him. They don't know what happened to him. So they had to go back and tell his wife that their son, that her husband's gone. Right. And then these are, you know, women that are, you know, these are Serb women scared to death because they know they're under the protection, in this case, of the British soldiers, but, you know, as soon as they're gone, they don't know what's going to happen to them. So there's victims on all sides, you know, these things. And then this is American soldiers patrolling with the kids following them in Kosovo.
So let's talk about how you got into Afghanistan on this trip, which I think you're going to do anyways, right? This was just an incredible story. I mean, it just, you know, with each one of these stories, I'm like, and you went back and you did it again, right?
Well, this story is really amazing. You'll kind of figure it out why it's so. This is February 2001, 7 months before 9/11. Now, of course, you know, I had no idea 9/11 was going to happen or anything about that, but I was in Afghanistan 7 months before. Why? Well, the Post, myself and a reporter named David Finkel, the Post had started this year-long project where we would follow migration around the world and how it's impacted the world. And we started in Afghanistan because, ironically, Afghanistan in 2001 had this amazing, I think it was 2 or 3 year long drought that had just destroyed everything. And so Afghanistan had the largest internal displacement of refugees of any country because of the drought. And it was really bad. I mean, there were, families stayed as long as they could. Their crops died. They would start eating their animals. The animals died. And then there was just nothing. Mm-hmm. So they just had to leave. And so of course, the problem was, okay, how are you going to get into Afghanistan? Because it was, at the time, controlled by the Taliban, who at that time weren't, it wasn't like we were big enemies with them, but for example, you could not, photography was not allowed under the Taliban. So that presented a predicament.
Problem for you, yeah.
But we had difficulty getting in. And finally, somebody we got to know that worked for the UNHCR, the United Nations, said, we're flying to Herat, which is a city next to the border of Iran. Come with us and we'll see if we can talk them into it. Well, we ended up getting arrested as soon as we arrived there. And they took us to the governor of Herat, who was a Taliban leader. But it was really interesting. He was a really wise person. I mean, he yelled at us and goes, I knew you were trying to sneak in this country. I don't appreciate that. He goes, but I appreciate what you're trying to do. And he goes, I'll let you stay. This is when he gave me the big warning.
The big but, yeah.
If the Vice and Virtue Squad catches you taking photographs, I can't help you. So we were, on one hand, we were allowed to travel. On the other hand, it was, dangerous. But what I discovered was, as long as you're out in the countryside taking photographs, you were okay. And the first place we went to, and this is a refugee camp outside of Herat, which was a desperate situation. And there was some food, but not a lot. And you can just see the tents were just for miles and miles. And, people thought there was going to be something for them at the end of the road, and there wasn't. There wasn't much. So we ended up traveling from Herat all the way through Afghanistan to Pakistan. And we actually stayed in Kandahar, which at the time, it's a very long story, which I won't get into it, but Kandahar at the time was where a lot of people thought bin Laden was. And the U.S. at that time was still trying to target him. So there were journalists there in Kandahar from CNN waiting. They were actually he was a Pakistani working for CNN who was there in case that did happen. And this is, I don't have another photograph. This truck, we followed it for a while. We were at it was kind of like a truck stop, and the driver was in eating, and all the other people were in the truck, and he said, I feel bad for them. They don't have any money. They don't have any food. I can't do anything for them. He says they probably haven't eaten in several days. And one of them had this white embroidered handkerchief. One of the refugees in the truck here, that was a love letter from his wife. It was very touching. But they were on their way to Iran hoping to find work.
In the interest of, there we go. So let's talk about now you go back. 9/11's happened. And you think it's a good idea to go back to Afghanistan?
9/11, yeah, 9/11 happens, and it was really weird because we did part of this whole migration where we went from Pakistan to Turkey and then followed Turks sneaking into Europe to work, and I had this idea of, well, we should find somebody going at the very, once, and then finding people going to the U.S. And I said, what if we can find people, Afghans from the U.S. wanting to go back to Afghanistan? And the only way they would do that would be to do it through the Northern Alliance. And just quickly, the history back at this time, in 2001, the Taliban controlled almost all of Afghanistan except for a sliver up on top, which was the Panjshir Valley, which was controlled by this amazing leader that a lot of people just loved, called Massoud, who controlled the Northern Alliance. And so when I was in Washington, I got to meet people that said, we'll help you if you want to, go through Afghanistan. And then, coincidentally, I was in Russia about 3 or 4 days before 9/11 happened. And I actually arrived here a couple of days before, and I read in the paper that Massoud had gotten assassinated. This was 2 days before 9/11. Massoud was being interviewed by a TV crew that blew themselves up and killed him. Well, who did that? Al-Qaeda did it. And why did they do that? Because they killed the Taliban's #1 enemy, Massoud. And I don't know if you remember, but the U.S. was asking the Taliban, we need you to turn over bin Laden. They said, we can't do that. He's our guest. And he's our guest that just killed our biggest enemy. So that it was extra insurance that Al-Qaeda did to ensure that the Taliban never turned him over. But anyway, so I ended up going back through with the Northern Alliance through the Panjshir Valley, which, as you can see, is spectacular. I mean, this is probably one of the most beautiful trips that I ever took. But it's also the most scariest trip I ever took. We drove in a Russian Jeep. This is part of it. It was actually a Jeep being used by ACTFED, which was a relief agency, and they needed to take it down to the edge of where the Northern Alliance was. That was close to Bagram Air Force Base near Kabul. This is where the fighting was going to start, so they gave us a ride. And so we took this Jeep for 2 days through the Panjshir Valley on the most terrifying drive I've ever been on. And the reason is because the roads are non-existent and you're, 5,000 feet up. And the roads were a lot of times like this. And I would be on this side of the Jeep and I'm looking down and I'm holding my friend here and there's like cars, 1,000 feet down. And it's like that all day long. And I was just terrified. So I think it was the end of the second day, might have been the third day actually, we get to what's called the Anjuman Pass. And the Anjuman Pass is 15,000 feet up. That's how high we were. And at this point, it's just a snowstorm hits. And we find this mud hut, which is actually the Afghan version of a truck stop. And we ended up staying there overnight with about 30 Afghanis. And it turned out that the snowstorm was so bad that the driver called back to the relief agency and they said, the pass is going to be closed for 2 weeks. You should come back. And I'm turning to my reporter friend. I said, there's no way I'm going back on that road again. It's just, there's just no way I was going to do it. And so we met these, so these are the Afghans, and there's one Pakistani guy who sold gyms. And he spoke a little English, and they found some people that were going to take us across by horseback for $40 a head across the Anjuman Pass. And I've never ridden a horse before, but that sounded...
Sounds like a great idea, yeah.
That sounded better than going back the other way. So we start out in this, it would look, I was thinking, God, this is great, We're on the back of a horse, we're kind of slowly going. And then about noon, all of a sudden the skies just darken. And this huge storm hits, and I'm like, oh my God. And it's funny that the last photographs here, this is just when it was getting bad. And then it got so bad that I had to put my camera down, and I was like, because I couldn't take photographs anymore, and I was scared of my camera. But what happened is that we made it through the storm. About 4 in the afternoon, we came across another mud hut, and I'm like, oh my God, thank God. And we were going to stop, and our guide said, no. If we go another half hour, we're at our final destination. And of course, we're all so cold. We're like, no, we got to stop for a while. So we jump out, and I remember running to the fireplace and warming up, which was the biggest mistake, because when we walked back out, everything froze. It's like it got wet, and I wasn't really dressed for this. I had like blue jeans and long underwear, and that was it. And so we start the march again, and I remember I was just watching my watch. 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour.
What was going through your mind? What were you thinking?
I was getting, at like 40 minutes, I was like, this is weird, An hour, I was getting really nervous. And then about an hour and a half, all of a sudden, we were back up into, in the mountains on these small trails, again, like about this big with the 2,000-foot drop. And I said, there's no way there's a village anywhere near us now. And that's when I thought maybe these guys were going to kill us. And, I didn't know what they were going to do, because, I had like $10,000, $15,000 of cash on me, plus all my equipment. And, and then this snowstorm, really horrible sleet storm hits us, and it was that piercing, sleet, to the point that all the horses started hiding there behind the other one's rear ends to protect themselves. And at this point, I was so cold that I knew if I fell off the horse, I would be able to stand. And I remember just leaning like this, because the cliff was here, like if the horse slipped,
Trying to help the horse a little
maybe
bit.
I would fall on and so it was terrifying. And of course, I was just saying to myself over, why did I ever do this? And I mean, at that point, it looked like there's no way we're going to get out of this.
So when you came down the other side, what did you see?
What happened was slowly, at one point, we finally started breaking out into, flat land again. And for whatever reason, the horses, I don't know how it happened, but we were so spread apart that I couldn't see any of the horses in front or behind me. So I was basically by myself. And the only thing I could do is just see the footprints, the hoof prints. And so I just kept following them. And it's funny, the horse at this point just wanted to eat. It was just stopping and, whenever it saw some food, like some, whatever. But, I pushed them on. And then all of a sudden we started going through a village, and I could hear these voices. And I was like, oh my God, I don't speak the language. Everybody's gone. Do I stop in this village? Do I keep following these tracks? And, that was a situation where you kind of realize how vulnerable you are when you're in another country and you don't speak the language. And, but anyway, to shorten the story, I continued following these footsteps, and then I saw this distant light, and it ended up, I got there, and it was the home where they all were. And I fell to the ground, and the guys picked me up. The Afghans are laughing, of course. Ha, 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 ha. Bring me in, and, I'm like this, just totally freezing. But later on, we talked to our Afghan guides, and one guy goes, yeah, this is the second worst I've ever been in. We've never had it this bad before. But so that's a sample, that was an example of my nerves were shot before I even got to the story, And then we had another 2 days of the same roads, so.
In our final minutes, I know because about another 10 minutes or so, let's talk about going to the Northern Alliance, then get into Iraq a little bit.
Very briefly, we finally get to where the Northern Alliance is positioned, which is about 30 miles from Kabul. And they were basically still training, and I looked at these troops, I was going like, these guys, they're not ready yet. I was worried about following them in. And you can see in the background, that's actually B-52 bombing Taliban positions as they get prepared. And then we finally made the move in, and I met a commander who gave me the heads up. He said, "We're coming, follow us."
Going to Kabul.
Yeah. And this is one of their tanks hit a landmine, and I was luckily far enough. It blew me back like 10 feet off the ground, but luckily I didn't get hurt. As you can see here, medicine was rudimentary. They didn't have anything. They're carrying. This guy had lost his foot, and they just didn't have any. I guess whatever medicine they had. And we finally get into Kabul, and these kids rushed us, and I didn't know if they were going to attack us or what. And luckily, they were like, "Hey, you're here." And it was interesting. The Taliban just melted away. I mean, they're from Afghanistan. The people that got caught up were the foreign fighters, the Al-Qaedas, and they were the ones that had nowhere to run. And so a lot of them ended up getting killed. They just killed them on the spot. You'll see one like this is an example.
Mob action.
Mob action. It was really interesting. During this period, Kabul, Afghanistan was so excited. They were free from the Taliban. All of you have probably heard of the many restrictions. One of which was, Afghans love to fly kites, and they were kite flying as music, as photography had been banned. So you would see these kites all over the city, afterwards. And then, as you said, we'll move on to Iraq, 2003.
So this time you don't embed.
After my experience in the Gulf War, I said, "There's no way I'm going to be embedded." But it turned out to be very dangerous because we just traveled on our own through Kuwait into Iraq towards. First, we went to Basra, and this is a young girl she had a family, relatives, family. I think 19 of them were killed by a stray bomb from one of the jets, and she had lost her legs. We saw a lot of civilian injuries, and there wasn't a lot of medicine. A lot of people were being operated on without anesthetics. This is in the early days, and of course, when we did get into Baghdad, the whole city was being looted. Even though the U.S. troops had gone in there, they took their position was, we're not going to protect the city. So the whole city was just being looted outright.
So there was no thinking about civilian control or maintaining policing.
And this was at the Museum of Antiquities, and we just walked in there, and then the woman in front of us started crying, and then we found out she was the assistant director, but everything had just been
looted
trashed
out of there
and stolen, And as she said, our history's gone. Now, ironically, the only place that we found that was actively being protected at this time was the Ministry of Oil. And these are, you can see and these are actually looters with loot going by, waving to American troops as they are, as they're.
So let's talk about so there's many realities. So one reality is the reality we see through media back here in the States, that we've been victorious in the war, we've been welcomed with open arms, it's going very well. There's spontaneous gatherings to pull down statues of Saddam Hussein. What did you see on the ground in Baghdad?
Well, to me, it was total chaos, a lot of anger. I was talking a little bit about the hospitals. I went to visit hospitals, and the doctors were just incredible. This is like, you guys have been here for 2 weeks now. We've been asking for medicine. We have none. I'm operating on all these civilians without anything. I don't have any anesthetics to give them. you know. So there's this pent-up hostility that was developing immediately. You know, like, why aren't you helping us? You know, the statues, the tearing down of the statues is really interesting because they were very isolated instances, especially the first one that made all the news. And that happened the day before I got there. But I was talking to a lot of photojournalists who said, you know, they're in Iraq, they're seeing all this looting and stuff going on. They get this phone call and the editor's going, where are you getting the celebrations? And they go, we don't see any celebrations. What do you mean? CNN, they're all showing it, you know, and it was the same photograph, you know, the video that everybody's seen of the statue being torn down. That was done in front of the Palestine hotel where all the journalists were staying. So it's kind of a convenient, you know, spot. And, you know, a lot of it's a really complicated story, but a lot of the people that were tearing it down were supporters of Chalabi, who, I don't know if you remember, he was a guy that, not Rumsfeld, but Wolfowitz wanted to run Iraq afterwards. Of course, that never happened. So it was a big mess. And so I left Iraq the first time that I left after all this was, ironically, the day, I think 2 days after I got back was when Bush did the mission accomplished speech. And I hadn't seen any TV at all, you know, for the 2.5 months that I was gone. And I was watching our TV with just like, this isn't the war I saw, you know, because it was like TV was declaring victory. And in my mind, it was like, well, you know, we got a mess on our hands. So it was a very disturbing moment for me because, you know, I had seen this sort of media, especially with government-controlled media, whether it's in the Soviet Union or Georgia or the country of Georgia or anywhere else, or former Yugoslavia, where, you know, the media is expected.
Right, it's tightly held.
And I really felt naive. I realized, you know, our media is doing the same thing, you know.
And this was a different war in that now as a journalist in this war, you could be kidnapped, killed, ransomed. It was a different game.
Not at this, well, at this time it was less likely. When it did happen, when it started getting really dangerous, it was about a year late, about 6 months later, where people were, especially when Al-Qaeda, and this is more of the kind of the chaos during the earlier times. But yeah, that started happening later, and you know, the early days of Baghdad, I could walk around anywhere with my interpreter, and felt relatively safe. Maybe I wasn't, but I felt it. But you know, 6 months later, it was too dangerous. Mm-hmm. If you were an American journalist, you were, you know, you'd get kidnapped or killed. As a matter of fact, one of our journalists was in an armored car. He was coming back from Fallujah, and a bunch of people pulled up to the car and just started shooting their AK-47s at it over and over and over again. They had an armored car, but he could just see it slowly starting to reach a point where they were going to come through. And luckily, they ran out of bullets and drove on. But it got really, really bad. And I returned in November, and this is when the IEDs first started happening, and I'm with one of the medical units, and these are unfortunately soldiers that were first starting to get hit with the IEDs.
Did you ever feel when you were taking these photographs that you couldn't take these photographs? That these were private, sacred, these were very personal moments?
There's certainly a lot of times where I decided it wouldn't be appropriate to take the photographs. And a lot of that's just on a gut feeling. Mm-hmm. But, you know, it's really weird. There's been times where I've stood back and not taken photographs, and somebody will look at me and they go, why aren't you photographing this? So sometimes you never know, but you have to, but, you know,
like these are very tender moments here. These are very private moments, and
You know, but a lot of time, you know, like in this case, you know, you don't walk in and just start taking photographs. You kind of stay there long enough and spend time to where people get to know you and trust you. So there's always a period where I have to feel that wait until there's that moment where they realize this guy is okay,
right,
and you know, you can help us. And this is the guy that the lead surgeon, amazing guy, that I did that with. I spent a lot of time with him. We became really close. And then this is, you know, him spending off time after, you know, working 24 hours, you know, doing surgery. And then this is later on, this is in Tikrit, and this is the beginning of when the U.S. soldiers would start doing the night raids, where they would go in to homes looking for Ba'athist or Saddam Hussein people. And this created a lot of animosity as well, because for a lot of reasons. I mean, one of the, you know, what happens a lot, and this has happened even more in Afghanistan, is that somebody would go up to the U.S. soldiers and they go, this guy over here is a Ba'athist. This is what he's done. And so they raid the house, and then they find out that it's a cousin pissed off at his, you know, a friend or something. And this happened a lot in the early days in Afghanistan, where, you know, a lot, you know, not everybody that's in Guantanamo was guilty. There were a lot of innocent people there that were you know, people got a $10,000 reward for turning this guy in, who did nothing except that he was the enemy of somebody else. So it's a really dicey situation in terms, and sometimes, I mean, and I'm not saying, a lot of times they did have really good information, but it, you know, it's very difficult.
So I know we've been going for just over an hour, and everyone's probably...
Yeah, this is, I'll just end it with this. This is Iraq when I left, and this was back in 2003, but they were already building concrete barriers everywhere because of all the bomb blasts. You know, this is what happens. You know, it's another Berlin Wall, you know. You know, it's a sad thing. A beautiful city becomes a fortress.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming this evening, and thank you, Lucian, for coming to Chicago.
Thank you for having me
here with you.